Okay, let's have a look how we can deploy Jumpstart HCIBox to basically build a sandbox environment in Azure to try out Azure Local. Now, again, if you usually deploy Azure Local, you need some physical hardware to actually do this in your environments. However, again, since not everyone has this or you don't have it available, but you still want to try it out, we can now build these virtual clusters inside Azure as a sandbox environment, so you can actually test this and so on. Again, reminder, this is obviously not for production. This is for evaluation purposes only. There's also a lot of customers using this for automated testing and things like that, which is great. But again, imagine that this is just to try the product. So again, to actually get started with this, we just go to the Jumpstart HCI website, HCIBox website. And here you can find all the information, which we sometimes already went through. Again, if you, just as you remember, you also have here to estimate the cost, because we're going to deploy a pretty large virtual machine in Azure to actually get all these things up and running. We also have something where you can go to the Azure pricing calculator, and we will tell you how much that approximately costs. There's also an FAQ, so if you have any questions around this, we can actually go through this. You can see here, if you scroll down, you get more information on this as well. But let's jump into the getting started part. So again, we had a look at this before. Again, the use cases for this: proof of concept, sandbox environment for testing, demo environments if you want to show this to customer. If you, for example, don't have an Azure local environment with real hardware, you can actually use that as well. And so there's some architecture. Again, we mentioned this before, but again, it actually deploys a large virtual machine in Azure in some additional resources. And then inside that virtual machine, we use nested virtualization to actually create virtual Azure local machines to create an Azure local instance, which is basically the cluster running this. So again, you have more information on this, how this looks like. We will have a look at this, how it actually looks inside the virtual machine later on. But again, you don't need to actually even know much about this if you want to deploy this, but it's always good to know. So that then allows you obviously to create virtual machines on top of that Azure Local, or even deploy AKS enabled by Azure Arc as well. So there's a little bit of documentation on the deployment workflow. So we created some bicep templates to actually do all this, and a lot of PowerShell scripts, which are all automated basically after the deployment, to basically create you a very simple experience to go out and deploy this. And so let's go in the deployment part with Azure Bicep. And so if we go up here on the website, this gives you really the step-by-step guide how to do this. So the way I basically use this, I could now basically go and run this all on my local machine if I have the Azure CLI installed and so on, and do all that work. Now, what I prefer to do, makes it a little bit easier, is Azure Cloud Shell. So in that you have a environment which you can use in the portal, for example, and basically have the latest CLIs and tooling installed, and that's where you can use it. So I'm going to do that. Again, you're free to run this wherever you want. But again, let's go to like my Azure portal. Again, for those who are not familiar with Cloud Shell, this is how you start it. And the first time it will show you how, like if you want to set it up. In my case, it's already set up here. Again, it takes only like 30 seconds to actually do this. So one thing I want to mention though, is there is this new experience. So if you go to settings, you usually go maybe you're redirected to the beta version. So I'm going to use a feature called code, which is not available yet at this time in the beta version. So basically what we're going to do is just revert to classic if you end up in the new one. So if it looks like this, that's fine. Also, I mean, it will notify you when you want to use something which is not available. So let's go back to the guide here. And again, you can, if I run the Azure CLI, you would see that I'm already logged in here with the same credentials as I'm obviously logged into the Azure portal. If we jump here back, first what we need to do is basically clone this Git repo where we get all the different PowerShell scripts and bicep templates and so on. And there's a lot more in there, but we'll show you that in just a bit. So I go here, go and paste this, and just start to clone this. Now you can see, because I already have it here, it tells me it already exists. so it doesn't do it again. But again, this is what you would do, and it would take a few seconds to basically clone this repo here as well. So then after that, it says, okay, check for that you have the latest version. Now, again, in my case, I'm pretty sure I have the latest version. Basically, it says like you need to have version 2.65 or higher. Because you're using Azure Cloud Shell, you almost have always the latest one installed, but still, let's check on this if that's correct. And so we see here, yeah, we run 2.70, so that's a good thing. Let's jump back here as well. And then another important step now is actually to look up if we have enough resources to actually go and deploy the Azure Jumpstart HCIBox. Because we need this large virtual machine, we need to make sure that we have enough virtual CPUs available in our subscription and in that specific region. And also that we have actually, like for this specific VM family type as well. So the ES-V5 family, we need to have at least 32 CPUs on this. And obviously also in total, we need to have a certain amount available here. So let's go and check. And there are a couple of regions, we will talk about this in just a bit, which are supported for HCIBox. So not every Azure region can be used for HCIBox. I mean, you can try, but like there are maybe some unexpected errors happening in some cases. So we have a list, and I'm going to show you this on the page. So whenever you deploy this, make sure you check first that list if like your region is supported. But one of the supported region is East US. So we'll have a look at here now if we actually have enough usage here available. So if I scroll up here on the top, I can see here, yeah, I'm using already a couple of CPUs, but I still have room here, which I can use. And then for the ES-V5 family CPUs, I also have some room here of virtual cores. So I have at least 32 cores available here to use, which is great. So that should be fine. And then we go on and we create a service principal here. Now, in my case, I already did this because I don't want to show you all the secrets and don't want to have that all in the video. But what you need to do is create a service principal. And there are two options. You can use either at the Azure CLI, or you could use PowerShell for that. Now, if you run it in the Azure CLI, you basically can just copy paste this code, and then you just need to modify specific SPN name. This needs to be a unique name within your tenant. So in this case, like there's also an example how this looks like, and then you create it. You will get an output which will look like this. So again, you can see here, you will get your tenant ID, your password, you get your Jumpstart HCIBox display name, that's the name you chose basically to create it, and your app ID. So you need to basically then take this and copy paste this so that you have this available later for the creation. We will need that service principal to create the whole automation behind it, so you can use that. Again, as I mentioned, there's also an option to use PowerShell to do the same thing. Again, doesn't really matter which one you use, it's just like what your preference here. And then again, there is some information here, which I always highly recommend. If you go through this guide, the notes are actually always very important. So make sure you check out that you have the right settings here available. The other thing is now we're going to use Bicep. So we want to check that Bicep is up to date. Again, it's part of the Azure CLI. Since I have Bicep in Cloud Shell, I know this is going to be up to date. I'm not going to do this. But then what I also need to do is I need to figure out, okay, what is the specific ID of the Microsoft Azure HCI resource provider, which I have installed. So you can see here, I can just simply run this command here, and this will give me an output. And if you look at the output here, this is the ID I will need as well. So we will see then, like, write this all down, copy paste it, obviously. We will need this later in just a bit when we edit the Bicep parameter file. Now, importantly, there's also a note on this. So once you basically go out and you don't get any return from this, it's probably because in your subscription you don't have the resource provider installed here for this. So if you don't have that, you can just first run this command to actually register the resource provider, and that will take again a few seconds. And after that, you basically can run this command here again to get the ID. So this is all like just preparation to actually get this running. Also important, now we will go and edit the bicep parameter file. One thing which they also highlight here very big here as well, because of all the automation and the logon script, don't use the symbol, the $ symbol in your Windows admin password. And I will talk about this just in a bit, but otherwise the automation will fail. So that's something to keep in mind. So now we need to go and edit this main bicep parameter file. And you can see here we described all the different parameters you can set. They also have a default value here as well, which you could add. Now, everything which you need to basically go and add, you basically have in that file. So if I click on this bicep parameter file, this will take me to GitHub, and you can see here, I'll zoom in a little bit. This is how it will look like when you open it up. And this is all the information which you will need to add. Now, if we go back here, there's more we can do, right? So if you want to change some settings, some things which you want to test, for example, we have like a different DNS you want to use, for example, or you want to have some other settings changed. You can do that as well. So for example, here, this one is, for example, very important. We'll talk about this later in this video, is that it automatically deploys the Arc-enabled HCI cluster resources, or the Azure local resources in this case, after actually like with the logon script. You can also set this to false, but then you need to do the manual walkthrough to actually go out and create the Azure local instance or the Azure local cluster, depending on how you want to call it, to actually go out and have that. Now, if it's set to true, which is the default, it will automatically do that for you, which is absolutely the easiest way. But if you ever want to show how to create a cluster, you can set this, for example, to false. Another big part, what I change in my case, is going to deploy Azure Bastion. Now, Azure Bastion, for those who are not familiar with it, this is a way to actually then connect to an Azure virtual machine. And again, you can use multiple different ways to connect to your virtual machine we create in Azure. But I think Azure Bastion is the most easiest one, as well as most secure one in this case. So I don't need to open up any specific ports for this. So this is one I'm gonna set to true, and I'm gonna show you how we're gonna do this. So let me go back to Cloud Shell. And so since I already cloned this repo, I can now go to Azure Arc. And you can see here now you have all the different Jumpstart things in there, cloned from that specific repo. So let's go to Azure Jumpstart HCIBox. And that's basically where we have all the different artifacts and files in there, and script and automation in there. So what we want to go is we're going to into the bicep folder. This is where we're going to edit. And here you have all the different files already. Now, I'm going to do a clear here. One thing we want to edit now is the one thing here I showed you, the main bicep parameter file. So the way I can do this is just simply type code and then main bicep parameter. So this will up like a web-based editor in Cloud Shell. Again, this is the one thing I want to mention that doesn't work in the beta version of Cloud Shell. It only works in the classic one. So here you would get a message if it wouldn't happen. So again, depending on when you watch this video, this might be not a problem at all. So let's hit enter, and then we're going to have a look at the different parameters I'm going to set for my deployment. So here's my file here. And what I did, I already entered all the different information here, which I want. So I copied the SPN information here into this. I copied the secrets for that SPN, the tenant ID, the SPN provider ID, which we got for the Azure Stack HCI resource provider. And then I also set a username and a user password for the Azure virtual machine. I then also gave the name for the log analytics workspace. And then I set auto deployment cluster resource to true. And then also what I added here is deploy bastion. So now, again, some of them I had to add. So what I can do here is I can go and hit the save button here. I can also click Control S for save. And then I can do Control close to close the editor. So now we are more or less ready to actually go out and deploy this. So just to be aware of this, what we're going to do here is go back to the Jumpstart documentation page. And now, again, this is also described here on how to set these things up, right? So again, like everything I just showed you is also on the website. Now we need to do two things. We actually need to create a resource group in which we're going to deploy. Remember that the resource group location obviously is also the one where we're going to deploy the HCIBox as well. So I'm going to copy paste this first, and I'm going to go and basically say, okay, this, and now I need to change the name here for the resource group. Now let's do Tom HCIBox. Let's do 21 RG, and then for what I checked is East US. Again, there's a couple of different regions you can use to do this, and I will show you that in just a bit. But let's create this resource group. That should only take like a second. So we have created that resource group, and this will be the resource group we're gonna leverage. So let's copy paste this as well, and then we go back here, and what we can see here now, when it comes to what I want to actually show. So on the top of the page, you can actually find that HCIBox, where it can actually be deployed. So East US, Australia East, Canada Central, and West Europe regions are currently the ones which are working. Now, I still highly recommend that you check every time and also run the different commands to actually check if you have the resources available. Again, this can change. Obviously, we can add more regions. We can maybe remove some of the regions. So every time you deploy, please make sure you check this out. So let's go back again. That's why I said I chose East US as a location. And then we need to basically run this command, and this will basically kick off the first deployment. This will create the Azure resources we need, like the bastions, like the virtual machine for it, some storage account, all the things we need to actually manage this. So I copied this, and then let's go and paste this here. And now the only thing I need to change here is the resource group. So I did Tom HCIBox 21 RG. And you can see here it will use the main bicep file and the file here, the main bicep parameter file, which we just edited. So this is basically what we need to do. And if we run this, this will kick off the deployment. Now, after we kick this off, we will have to go, and if this deployment finished, we have to go into the Azure virtual machine and start basically with that, with the automatic log on to this, we will start the post-deployment tasks, which are automatically kicked off once we connect to the virtual machine. But we will have a look at that in just a bit. So this will take a couple of minutes to finish. So we'll give this some time. So once the deployment is done, we can actually go now back to the Azure portal and have a look at the virtual machine and connect to it. So for that, let's close this down. Let's go to our resource group here. Let's do for 21. And we have here my resource group. So if I go to this resource group, you can see here all the resources which have been deployed. So there's a couple of disks for the virtual machine, an automation account, the bastion service. I basically added as optional. And then here you also have some storage accounts, as well as actually the HCIBox client VM. So that's the VM where everything runs inside. So this is the large VM which is configured. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go and basically go to that client VM. Now, we basically have done now the deployment part. So let's go back to the Jumpstart guide here. And so it describes again, okay, hey, after that, we need to kick off the post-deployment part here. So what we can do here is we go to the next documentation page, and this is basically describes how we go on from here. Again, this is the post-deployment part, which will basically, once we connect to the virtual machine, start a auto logon script, which will run then all the automation to create the HCI local machines, which are the virtual machines, which would be the physical machines, which simulate the physical machines. It will go out, create the management resources around this, like an Active Directory and all that. It will also then, after these machines are created, it will go out and create the Azure local instance or cluster, so that you can then actually go out and manage this. So just to basically describe this, there's a couple of things how you can now connect. Now, again, as I mentioned already, I used Azure Bastion to actually go and connect to this, but there's also other things you can do. You can obviously use just simple RDP to do that and open up, for example, the RDP port, which is 3389, to connect to that machine. And here is described how you would go and create that inbound rule for this. Now, again, keep in mind that this opens up and exposes, and depending on the case you have here, exposes that port to the internet, which in many cases you don't want. So you have other options here as well, which again, I prefer to use Bastion for this. This adds, by the way, a little bit of more cost to it because you're going to use the Bastion service. But again, I think this is probably the most secure one and the most easy one to handle. But you can also use just-in-time access or JIT, which basically says, okay, hey, I want to open up this port, but only for a specific time and only from a specific source IP, for example. So this is a very easy way of also doing that as well without deploying Bastion. But again, in my case, we're going to use the Bastion service. So let's switch back to the Azure portal, and we can see here now the virtual machine, obviously, as I mentioned, is running here. And what we can do is we can simply connect and say, okay, connect using Bastion. And then this will then open up the authentication page. Now here, I'm going to change this to basically the password I set in the parameter file, right? I remember when I mentioned the Windows password there with the username Thomas. So I'm going to click on connect here and then click on allow. And this will open up now the connection to that system. So what you can see here now is it runs the auto deployment or auto logon script here and starts the installation of all the different resources which are needed. It uses some winget tooling, for example, to install certain packages in that machine. And then from that point on, it will also install all the different features which are needed, like Hyper-V and all that, to create the virtual machines there as well. This will now run for a couple of hours, right? So you can just leave this running after you logged in. That's very important. You can now leave this running and then basically come back a few hours later in that process. But since we don't want to wait, I already prepared something to show you what's going to happen. So now let's switch back to the documentation here. Here's the explanation of hey, this is the post logon script, which runs the PowerShell deployment. And so once this is done, I already have another HCIBox here, which is already done. Again, this took a few hours to complete because there's a lot of things obviously to do. What we can do is quickly check if everything here is created, at least the servers and everything correctly here. So we can see here now, if I open up Hyper-V Manager, inside that Azure virtual machine, it created more virtual machines, which are running inside that machine. For example, the host, the two hosts, right? The Azure Local machines, which build the cluster, and then the management VM. Again, you have that in the architecture diagram explaining if you're interested in more. But again, it's just a simple check to see if everything is there. Now, let's have a quick look on the documentation again, what would be next. So the next step would be that we go out and validate the installation of this, right? That we can actually go out and see if all the resources are actually deployed and so on. Now, there's one important step here, which you need to look at. So we talked about the parameter auto-deploy cluster resources, and that's usually set to true. But if you set this to false, you will need to go out and now start this process of creating the Azure Local cluster or instance. And basically we go through this in this step-by-step guide, how you can actually go and do this. Now, since we did not overwrite this or we set this to true, the deployment, we can go to the deployment complete step. So once the deployment is done, we can see this if we navigate to the HCIBox cluster. On the settings, on the deployment, we can verify this. So let's do this and then figure out what we can do with the HCIBox cluster, which gives us a local Azure Local instance. So for that, I go back to the Azure portal and I go to Azure Arc. That's where we find all the things which are Azure Arc related, as well as like connected to Azure. That includes, for example, Azure Local as well. So I navigate to Azure Local, and if I click on all systems, I can see all my Azure Local instances here. Now, you can see here in our subscription, we have multiples of those. In yours, probably only will be one. But so you click on the one, which is the one you want to have a look at. And this is basically the Azure Local instance, basically the cluster. This now simulates what could be run on premises in your own data center or edge location. And you can then basically check out and manage this. And again, it looks like an Azure resource. This is obviously the way Azure Local works. But imagine that like this would actually run in a customer's data center or edge location, and they can manage it directly from Azure using the Azure control plane, which has a couple of benefits here as well. And we'll dive into this in just a bit. But you can see here now, if I scroll down and I click on machines, I find those two hosts, which I just showed you in the Hyper-V manager, which simulate the physical hosts here in that specific case. So now we have a functional HCIBox cluster, which represents an Azure Local instance, and we can now go out and deploy virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters on top of it. We can check out monitoring and alerts and much, much more.